ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and distinguished guests, allow me, as the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies this year, to welcome all of you. It's my great honor and privilege this year to host the 2011 Edwin O. Reischauer Memorial Lectures. My name is Mark Elliott. I'm a professor of Chinese and Inter-Asian History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And this year, as probably most of you know by now, I've been filling in for Professor Bill Kirby as director of the Fairbanks Center. This year's lectures are being given by Professor Benjamin Ellman of Princeton University. And as you know, this series traditionally has comprised 3 lectures, the first of which is today, the second of which will be given tomorrow, and the third on Friday. All of the lectures are at this time, and all of the lectures are in this place. So if you were able to find your way here today in the terrible weather that we have, you'll certainly have no trouble finding your way back tomorrow or Friday when the sun is out. You may have a harder time coaxing yourself indoors, but I have faith that you are up to that task. Let me also cordially invite everybody to the reception that will take place directly after each of these lectures. My recollection is that each day we are being required to have the reception in a slightly different place. So there we have a challenge. Lydia, would you be so good as to remind us where the reception is being held today? Okay, so this is in the, what do we call this, the reception room? The gathering room, excuse me. The gathering room, the Ted and Doris Lee gathering room, just down to the left, opposite the small garden. And before I say more about the speaker, let me briefly thank Lydia Chun, the Associate Director of the Center, and our very able staff, Linda Clues, Mariah Tolgard, and Yasha Smilak, for their assistance in organizing these events. Let me also thank Kelly Mattioli, who is our graphic designer and who did, I think, just a splendid job on this year's poster. I hope you will agree. The Reischauer Lecture Series is something I want to say something about first before introducing our speaker. This series was established in 1985. The first speaker came in 1986. That was William Theodore DeBerry. And this was to honor Professor Edwin O. Reischauer by celebrating his distinguished contributions to the study, not only of Japan, but of China and Korea as well. The series historically has brought forward current scholarship that deepens understanding of East Asia as a region. This year's lectures, under the title Undoing, Redoing Modern Sino-Japanese Cultural and Intellectual History, offer the promise of a brilliant addition to this series. Many of these lectures have found their way into print in the past, and I'm hopeful with Professor Ellman's kind collaboration that we might be able to consider that same thing this year. But that is a matter for later discussion. I've sometimes been asked this year, why is it that the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies is the one that sponsors the Reischauer Lectures and not the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies? And indeed, this was a question I asked myself when I first came to Harvard a few years ago. There are various answers I've gotten from some of the veterans of East Asian Studies here. I guess the simple answer is that those of us at the Fairbanks Center, which after all began as the Center for East Asian Research, believe that Chinese studies at Harvard, East Asian Studies at Harvard, in fact, owes a special debt to Edwin Reischauer. As many of you know, Professor Reischauer's first book, which was based on his 1939 doctoral thesis he wrote in the Department of Far Eastern Languages, as it was then called, was a study of the travels of the Japanese monk Ennin to the Tang court in the mid-9th century. This book was published in 1955, and it offers a point of departure into understanding the development of the culture, religion, literature, and history of the region, in which modern national boundaries don't play such a paramount role. And I think that this is the idea behind the Reischauer lectures, to get beyond national boundaries. During his many years teaching at Harvard, beginning in 1939, the very year he finished his degree, he was immediately hired to co-teach with John Fairbank the famous rice paddies course, which in altered form continues to be offered today. This class was not divided by region. It was divided by period. Reischauer taught the first half of the class, which starting in 1940 was called Chinese 10A, Cultural History of the Far East. And then Fairbank taught the second half of the class, which was called History 83B. He was in the history department and known as the Modern Far East. So no wonder they had to come up with a cleverer name for it all, since who could remember that these were even connected in some way. Also in the textbooks that they co-authored, Reischauer and Fairbank divided responsibilities, where Reischauer took responsible for pretty much everything that was pre-modern, regardless of where it was, and Fairbank the modern. I'd like to also point out, speaking about Reischauer's early teaching in the Department of East Asia, what's now East Asian Languages, that in 1942 he ran a special introductory course in Japanese that was way oversubscribed, according to the Crimson. And he recruited some very promising Harvard undergraduates to that class, some of whom went on to very distinguished careers, among whom is Professor Howard Hibbett, who is here with us today, who was in that class as far as I understand. I hope Professor Hibbett will correct me if I am wrong. Is that correct? Were you in that 1942 class with Professor Reischauer? Does that sound familiar? Yes, okay. Thank you. Give me a moment of palpitation there. Now, I think few of us today can imagine attempting to mount such a course that covered all of the Far East, all of pre-modern or all of modern. And indeed, over the years, it has become progressively more difficult to find scholars talented enough and brave enough to attempt the kind of synthetic approach to the study of East Asia that we look to incorporate in the Reischauer lectures. And so we are very fortunate today and tomorrow and the next day that we have one of the masters of the history of early modern East Asian thought and science with us, and that's Professor Benjamin A. Ellman. Especially considering that he is, at this time, also chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at Princeton, we're especially grateful to him for taking the time to come here for these lectures. Professor Ellman is Professor of East Asian Studies and History at Princeton. His teaching and research fields include Chinese intellectual and cultural history from 1000 to 1900, history of science in China, the history of education in late imperial China, and Sino-Japanese cultural history. He earned his PhD at Penn in 1980 and taught at Colby and Rice and had a couple of postdocs before finally landing at UCLA in 1986. Those of you now going on the job market wondering what happens after peregrinations, fear not. Things will always end up well if you do good work. And it was, in fact, at UCLA that Ben and I first got to know each other when I was a junior professor at UC Santa Barbara up the coast. And UCLA hosted once a semester a wonderful gathering of all of the China Studies folks in Southern California. And I remain very grateful to the encouragement I got from Professor Ellman in those years. In 2002, he moved to Princeton, where he remains today, and he continues to be, of course, extremely active. His publications, I think, are known to just about everybody here. The first book, one of those field-changing, making books from philosophy to philology, which I'm happy to say Harvard published, Intellectual and Social Aspects of Change in Late Imperial China. Other books, the Classicism, Politics, and Kinship book, the mammoth Cultural History of Civil Examinations in Late Imperial China, which I actually read all of. And I'm sure all of my students have read all of it too, haven't you, students of mine? I thought so. And then more recently, On Their Own Terms, Science in China, and most recently, A Cultural History of Modern Science in China. The lectures today and the next couple of days are, as I say, under this general rubric, as you see, Undoing, Redoing Modern Sino-Japanese Cultural and Intellectual History. The title of his talk today is The Great Reversal, The Rise of Japan and the Fall of China After 1895 as Historical Fables. Professor Ellman's lecture will last about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, I will introduce our discussant today, Professor John Dower. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Benjamin Ellman.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Fairbanks Center and also the Reischauer Institute for making it possible for this lecture series. We at Princeton have been in many ways mimicking your lecture series by establishing a lecture series where we bring in distinguished scholars to Princeton, and we've invited many of you to our lecture series. The talk I'm going to be giving today will at first perhaps seem dysfunctional to you in terms of the discussion of the 19th and 20th century today, and then turning back toward 16th, 17th, and 18th century cultural history between Japan and China. But I think if you stick with it, I think you'll begin to see that fundamentally what we're looking at is the problem of beginnings and endings. And I know when I was a graduate student in history, and I think many of you who are graduate students in history, very often your mentors tell you that you pick a point to end with, and then you go backwards and try to find a point to lead up to that ending. That's what Nietzsche would call sort of a crab walking backwards. And in many ways, Nietzsche's notions of historians was that they were crabs. They always walked backwards from the present in this situation. I'm not sure he was being fair to crabs, but certainly historians often do think that way. And I know, for example, in my research, I began with destination point and then went back to the beginnings of these issues and got lost because I never made it back to the endings that were involved. And I think the beginnings and endings theme, I think, are very, very important. I think some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are based on end themes, end stories. And what I hope to do is undo that story and talk tomorrow and Friday about what happens when we undo the story, forget about it, disremember it, unrepress it or whatever, and then try to get back to how beginnings look like from the point of view of the beginnings. I think all of us share a sense of we have no idea what the world will look like in 2050. We have some guesses. And we can make some prognostications. But those in 2050 that look back will wonder about what we said about some of these issues, will wonder about how Japan ultimately will revive from its current crises, how China will deal with the certain issues, and whether the rise of China is really a bona fide narrative for the 21st century. We can make guesses about it, make conclusions about it, but in the end, we are not the endings, we are the beginnings of those kinds of issues in the future. So I'd like to sort of, in many ways, look at one set of endings and question those endings, particularly the rise of Japan and the decline of China ending, which all of us have been educated in. Certainly I was as a graduate student, as an undergraduate. And I think we've trained our graduate students in that storyline, that since the Meiji, since the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, Japan was the rising power of East Asia, and China was the lost empire, the failed Oriental state, the despotic state, the primitive state as it became emerging in many of the issues. Now, part of the issues will be talked about today in terms of something that happened at MIT in 2006 when a series of images were put on about Japan leaving Asia and Chinese graduate students at Harvard and at MIT especially growing very irate over those particular images, how they were interpreted and how they were presented. I'm very pleased to be an opening act for Professor Dower today to talk about these issues from the point of view of what they mean historiographically, and also in many ways to bemoan the fact that the debate at that time got caught up in a whole range of accusations and counter-accusations that were unfortunate and undeserved, but nonetheless opened up a perspective on the issues that in the 21st century, Japanese and Chinese views of each other are changing dramatically, and the Chinese students are no longer participating in a victim's narrative of the 20th century. They see a different narrative for China in the world, and that Japan and China will have to forge new relationships in the 21st century. And I think that debate, its anger and its animosities back and forth over these images, I think has to be dealt with rationally and straightforwardly. I'm not applauding what the Chinese students did. I think much of what they did at that time was overdone. Many of their demands were overdone. But nonetheless, the images were upsetting. I will show some of them today with your acceptance. They are, in many ways, the kinds of images that no one would want to see, and certainly not have ballyhooed for an audience to signify your own country's triumph, your own country's success. but in fact, those were how those images were used at that time. I'm not trying to Japan bash or to praise China in these issues. I'm not trying to provoke a rise of China narrative or even accept the rise of China in the 21st century as a narrative any more than I accept the rise of Japan narrative as an automatic historical truth in the 20th century. I'm simply opening up questions for what happens when one does the effects of a war in 1894-95 on both Chinese, Japanese, and the world community, and how that particular narrative creates a set of issues that we have since accepted uncritically for a long period of time, and that narrative is now changing. The failure narrative for China is increasingly falling by the wayside, and we're beginning to see that success story for Japan, particularly in the current crises, beginning to be questioned as well. How China has handled the Sichuan earthquake and how Japan has handled the recent earthquakes in the Northeast is also a sign of changing issues in the 21st century. Now, one of the things I want to start with is I'm going to be showing a lot of images. And as a cultural intellectual historian, I come to images very late. Unlike Eugene and others who were well trained in images from the very beginning, I was educated by them very late. And it was only when I ran into Mark Tansey's paintings at the Los Angeles County Museum one afternoon in the late 90s that I was suddenly struck with the power of images as optical illusions, as ideological statements, and as conceptual statements. And if you haven't heard of Mark Tansey, he's a wonderful spoof of postmodern art, postmodern ideas and concepts. And here in this particular painting, this is called Constructing the Grand Canyon. It's a massive painting. It's even larger than the scroll you see on the page here. And you can also see as you look through this that it is layers of text. Rather than layers of dirt, it is layers of language and text. And in many ways what has happened is the actors in this particular event, Derrida, Foucault, and others, have deconstructed the Grand Canyon and are now trying to figure out how to put it back together again. They've lost the guidelines, they've forgotten the issues of where these things go, and we can see here on this side here that we have either Foucault or Derrida sitting there trying to survey the proper placement of these layers of the Grand Canyon. And so in this sense, what I want to indicate that in terms of undoing and redoing, I am not necessarily just presenting a postmodern narrative of the issues of undoing a particular set of cases between China and Japan. I'm also suggesting that we need to redo these kinds of issues. A good deal of it has to do with teleology, the notions of how things lead to the present, and also how one breaks out of those teleologies, something we call de-teleologization. Now, in the framework of de-teleologizing a subject, I think that's only half the step. I think the second step is to re-teleologize based on newer issues and newer perspectives. I'm not arguing that the new teleology is the final teleology, but I am arguing that the newer teleologies are improvements over past teleologies, taking into account the standpoints and issues that came before. What we will say today will change in 50 years because the present, the future lecturer here at the Reischauer lectures will say something quite different on many of these issues in the year 2050. So I'm not arguing for a re-teleology that will ultimately command respect in 30 or 40 years. I think we all realize the sciences in 100 years will have different things to say to us than they say to us today. And similarly, the social sciences and the humanities go through these changes as well. And I'm not trying to argue for what I say here as normative or a perspective that all of you should adopt. I am suggesting that it is a perspective that we need to take seriously as we look at the issues and teleologies of the past. Hence, deconstruction fails because it is unable to come to grips with the newer narratives that we formulate based on the issues that emerge from the present. Art historians have an easier time of it. They know that artist always looks at past painting from the present, and because the present is always changing, the artist always refracts, always, in terms of parallax, produces new interpretations of the past, bends the reality, changes the reality, and produces paintings that don't seem to be quite what we expect. And I think art historians have long understood that the present always changes, therefore our perspective on the past refracts that past. And so I think we have a good deal to learn from modern art and modern historians, and from artists like Mark Tansey, who break down the Grand Canyon and then show the futility of trying to reconstruct it textually by the scholars who've deconstructed it. We'll be coming back to Mark Tansey's paintings to show a different scene of war and literature that I think, and painting, that will in many ways evoke the issues that I think are associated with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. Now, one of the paintings or pictures that we've seen for the advertisements is one of the holdings of the Harvard Library, and this is a drawing by Henry Mayer, an illustrator in 1894 on the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. And this one, if you'll look at it closely, it'll be very close to the woodblock prints that we will see from the Japanese artists of the late 19th century. And you can see in many ways that Meyer is in many ways copying the forms of the presentations of facts on the ground as pictures from woodblock prints in this period of time. And you can see the violence that it's involved here, the Japanese soldier in modern European uniform on horseback defeating Chinese, Manchu, bannermen soldiers on the battlefield in Korea. They are dressed in traditional costume, using swords, guns are prevalent, but this is a scene of a single leader in the Japanese army putting away pretty much a small division of so-called Qing troops in this particular issue. Again, this is an optical illusion. This is not the way it was. Even if this was a picture, it wouldn't necessarily be the way it was. We have to be very careful how we look at our realities and understand our realities. And what I'm suggesting to you is through words and through objects and through images, we see many optical illusions, and that these issues that I'm going to be showing you, with your permission, some of the more violent ones, are optical illusions that do not necessarily represent the events on the ground exactly as they occurred at that time. Now, the scenery is the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War is perhaps less famous today than the Russo-Japanese War because it is a regional war, even though I will argue today that it had great international significance. The invasion of Japanese troops into the Korean Peninsula was in many ways intended to take Korea from the tributary system hold that China had on Korea. The Japanese weren't sure of the victory in the beginning, but very quickly, by the winter of 1895, it was clear that they would march through and take advantage of the collapse of Qing forces and also the failure of Qing forces to bring in enough troops on Korea to deal with the army of Japan sufficiently. Similarly, in the Russo-Japanese War, the predominant area of warfare will be in Korea and also beginning also in Manchuria. Port Arthur will play an important part in many of these issues. Many of us have forgotten that Port Arthur was in many ways the Gibraltar of the East in the 1890s. It was the greatest fortification in the world outside of Gibraltar. And taking it was a very, very important site for the Japanese. And as they did with Singapore, rather than attack Singapore head first, they came from behind. That is how they took Port Arthur. They came from the land, from the Korean side, and then marched into Port Arthur from the land side and didn't take it head on. It was that well fortified. Certainly other sea battles were waged at Weihai and along the borders, but in these situations, the scenery was very, very reminiscent of warfare since. Korea is still on the map. The Sino-Japanese-American conflict over Korea remains in place on this same territory, and those of you who know your Chinese history know that Japan and China have gone to war over Korea many times. Arguably, the first Sino-Japanese War may have been in the medieval period when the Tang forces came in to help Silla, and then Silla tried very hard to get rid of these helpers so that they could form their own independent state. And then, of course, Hideyoshi's invasions in the 1590s, which could be the first or second war, depending on how you're counting, making 1894, 95, the second, third, or fourth war, depending on how you're counting. So I want to also put these things in larger perspective. We've forgotten the wars with Silla. We've forgotten, in many ways, Hideyoshi's war, a very well-forgotten war that the Japanese do not try to focus on as a failed war or a war without victory. It was simply a retreat, the death of Hideyoshi, and the continuation of Japan in their home islands. So this is the scenery, this is the area, and I want to look at, in this situation, the narratives that have emerged from this warfare of this period of time, and how it's been presented, how it's been argued, and how in many ways this became a debate and argument when Professor Dower and others put together this MIT website with the Japan leaving Asia argument and motif for presentation on a website. What was interesting about that problem was that many of these images have been shown at the Philadelphia Art Museum, here in Boston at the Fine Arts Museum, and other places, but because of their limited scope, they didn't have quite the influence that they would have had. Once you put things online, as we've all learned from the 2006 example, we have very little control over the audience, and we have to be very careful how we present those images and how they are interpreted. And I think in many ways, MIT was forced to bring those images down and then put them back up with language and interpretation that were acceptable for presentation for a much broader audience beyond the normal realm of those who attend museums. Now, I'd like to give you two films first to get a view of the so-called imagery. These are optical illusions as well, even though they're actual films. And in this particular framework, this is a clip from the Sino-Japanese War. You'll see Japanese battleships attacking Chinese ships at the Battle of the Yalu River. And they last about 10, 15 seconds each, and I want you to get a sense of how they look to you. Well, the Chinese ships are the ones, of course, that are taking the beating. These are the Japanese ships. Those are the Chinese ships. Chinese ship being blown up. I didn't see any Chinese junks there. What I saw were Chinese battleships losing to Japanese battleships, ironclad vessels all around in this particular battle. Now, 10 years later, the more famous war on the international scene, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, we also have a clip of the Japanese defeating the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait. And I want you to notice the difference in firepower, what has happened in 10 years since 1895 to 1904, of what the Japanese can throw at the Russian Navy in this period of time. Note the guns have proliferated, and the fast-firing guns in particular are available. We are on the eve of World War II here. These are the battleships and the guns, except for the aircraft carriers, that will be fighting in the Pacific among American fleets and Japanese fleets over control of the Pacific. Now, this is the Junyuan of the Beiyang fleet under Li Hongzhang. And again, I'm reiterating, this is ironclad. This is not a junk from the Ming Dynasty. This is not the Zhenghe fleet. This is a modern vessel, many of them produced in Fuzhou at the Fuzhou shipyard, and also at the Shanghai shipyard and other shipyards and arsenals throughout China. Many of the fleet is also purchased from Germany, from France, and England, who made available ships in this period of time to the new navies of Japan and China and other emerging countries. The French-built Matsushima was the imperial flagship of the Sino-Japanese Navy. It was the fastest, quickest, and fastest-firing vessel available at that time. The Barrow shipyards in England, today they make nuclear submarines. Earlier they made battleships of this variety. And you can see the firepower of these battleships in the early 20th century, late 19th century, is quite considerable. Again, this is the Matsushima, a picture of it. This is the Dingyuan, the flagship vessel for the Li Hongzhang Navy, the Beiyang Navy, and one can see that this is purchased from Germany. It's a vessel purchased from Germany. In the woodblock prints, in this situation, the Chinese vessels became the black ships, as we'll see shortly, the Japanese vessels became the white ships, the good guys. Some of you may remember that when Commodore Perry was visiting Japan in the 1850s, the Japanese described those ships as the black ships because of the steam power the exhaust that they released. In this depiction of the Chinese versus Japanese Navy in the Sino-Japanese War, white and black became very clear in the woodblock prints, even though in the films the darkness was not so clear. So in this context, the Chinese Navy is being sunk as black ships by victorious, the good guys, ships of the Japanese. The Chinese sailors here are in many ways left to their own. There's no effort to save them, and this became a major issue in the international world at that time. How does one treat prisoners of war? How does one deal with sailors who have lost their ships? Do the enemies have to be able to bring them up and preserve them as much as possible? What is humanitarian? What is going on in these situations? Begins in this period of time. And it's an interesting discourse that the Sino-Japanese War confronts, and later the Russo-Japanese War confronts in terms of global etiquette in warfare. Now, the Second War, if we want to call it the Second War, turns out when you look at it from the beginning point, was a very, very important battle in military history. It was the first great naval battle of employing fully ironclad, steam-powered vessels. The Franco-Prussian War had been a land-based war. Certainly there was the Bismarck and other ships for the First World War. But the first major war as a test case for ironclad, steam-powered vessels remarkably came in this battle between the Japanese and the Chinese. In fact, if one goes back and looks at the rankings of these navies, in this period of time, the Qing Navy had 65 ships and ranked 8th in the world in 1893-94. The Japanese had 32 ships. They ranked 11th in the world. This was how you weighed in terms of tonnage, kinds of guns and armaments that were available. And Mengye and other graduate students I worked with at UCLA would go through these materials and quantify what the perspective on these navies was before and after this particular defeat. The Japanese naval fleet of 32 warships, 23 torpedo boats, had about 14,000 sailors. The Chinese had many more ships, but they were divided into 4 navies. And the Northern Fleet and the Southern Fleet, based in Fuzhou, had not worked together during the Sino-French War of 1883-84, and now the Southern Fleet wasn't going to come to the rescue of the Beiyang Fleet in 1894-95. So in other words, the Japanese full well knew that they were going to be taking on only 1/4 of the Chinese Navy, and they made quite clear that they were not going to threaten foreign interests in Shanghai or anywhere in South China, that they were only interested in the Beiyang Fleet and only interested in Korea and the domains of the North. So in this context, at the Yalu River battle, each side had about 12 ships in the class. China had the advantage in armor and weight in a single salvo, measured by those who study war naval history, while the Japanese had a decided advantage in speed of ships and total amount of metal thrown in a sustained exchange of salvos. I don't want to bore you with that kind of information, but what had happened, of course, was no one knew what was going to work here in the war as it worked out. Was bigger and heavier bombs going to work, or was quicker, faster firing guns going to work? And in many ways, what came out of the war was quicker and faster firing were the way to go. And you could see that in the Russo-Japanese War, those quick-firing guns and the maneuverability of the ships compared to the earlier cruisers and battleships were one of the lessons that were learned from this war. So in many ways, the war was a very, very important lesson to the British navies and other navies in terms of trying to deal with these particular issues. And we also know from this period of time that by losing the battle, China was obligated, according to the treaties at that time, to pay a huge indemnity. France had paid an indemnity to Germany, and later, of course, in the First World War, Germany would pay an indemnity to the Europeans, to the French and the English, and this would decimate their economies and in many ways make normalization of their societies and economies very, very difficult. In this period of time, Japanese industrialization and the building of the fleet that faced off against the Russians was in part made possible by the huge indemnity that was taken in from the Chinese Qing dynasty in 1894-95. Add to that later the Boxer Rebellion and Japan's portion in that, and a good deal of Japan's emerging as a major naval power. The financial resources for that comes from these indemnities paid by the Chinese to the Japanese, which is usually overlooked and underestimated. It was quite a bit of money, and I'll be giving you a figure for that shortly. So in that context, this warfare from the 7th largest navy in the world, the Chinese, to the 11th largest navy in the world, the Japanese, had turned into a victory for the Japanese and a complete failure for the Chinese. So far, I haven't used Confucianism, culture, values, the Mandarinate, the emperor's absolutism as a set of problems. I'm simply saying, based on the battlefield performances of these vessels, the quickness of the Japanese fleets, the faster firing guns, corruption on the Chinese side. Very often the bigger, heavier guns were firing cement-filled bombs and not bombs that would explode. So when they went through the Japanese vessels, they didn't explode. So corruption based on the Shanghai arsenal, supply lines and others also mattered quite a bit. So from a purely warfare studies kind of framework, this war in many ways was not that predictable. Many Japanese were not sure that the Japanese would win, but in the end it became a very quick victory after the winter of 1895, and particularly the taking of Port Arthur from the land side, that in many ways this became a fiasco for China and a remarkable unexpected victory for the Japanese. And I think we need to remember that before the war, no one predicted particularly that Japan would win. Even Japanese were not that sure about it. And in many cases, people felt China, because of its scale, its size, the troops it could muster, would win. As it turned out, the Chinese could not get their troops to Korea to fight land battles on an equal level with the Japanese. In every major land battle in Korea, the Japanese outnumbered the Chinese on the battlefield, the Qing army on the battlefield. That was because they controlled the sea lanes and because Chinese could not land troops onto, or allies could not land allies onto the Korean peninsula. Again, I'm not talking about Confucianism, I'm not talking about language or kings or other arguments. I'm giving you certainly the kinds of logistics that were involved in this particular warfare. What I'm also suggesting is that China could have won this war had different circumstances been in place. Had the Japanese had to fear the Fuzhou Navy coming and uniting with the Northern Fleet, that would have doubled the tonnage and the power of the Chinese Navy in facing off the fleet from Yokosuka, from Japan. Would the Japanese have gone to war over Korea at that point? Unclear. But nonetheless, that was certainly a fear and something that people had to take into account. Now, many of the drawings I'm going to show you from this point on about the war are done by woodblock print artists who also produce many of the quaint woodblock prints that many of you buy when you go to Tokyo or to Yokohama or you see in museums and other places here. These quaint images of a quaint Japan, I think, are very prominent. They're a wonderfully tasteful, artistic presentation of a rural Japan, and in many ways they fill our art fields, they fill our university museums, and they are filling the collector items of those who have Hokusai's views or have the other views of Japan in this period of time. The late 19th century artists who produced these on a large scale will also produce the woodblock prints that were produced and put on place in the MIT 206 website that is still up. I hope some of you will take a look at that website, perhaps after today, and also begin to recognize the debates that it produced before. So these artists are doing many things, and these artists cutting the woodblocks, making the prints, doing the colors, all of these artistic aspects are going to be in the service of a kind of a photography, optical illusion photography, to sort of tell the story from the point of view of how the Japanese victory happened, how the great victory over the Chinese emerged, and the Chinese are going to be seen as the losers, and the Japanese are going to be seen as the winners. Now, these other aspects of it we also have to bring into place. There was a great Japan craze in the late 19th century, as many of you know. The woodblock prints and arts had influenced Claude Monet. Here is an example of a painting of Madame Monet in Japanese costume, circa 1875, with a kimono in dress. Those of you who visited Giverny know that it's full of these woodblock prints, all artistic for the most part, tasteful, and aesthetically of a high standard. None of these warlike images per se, or images of Japan from the point of view of a modern state, emerge in this situation. So there are many different voices, and I don't want to indicate that the militaristic voice is the only voice in these particular paintings, but it is a significant journalistic voice that you'll see entering into Japanese newspapers and also American newspapers as presentations of the war. Now, as these Chinese vessels were destroyed, we can see the black ships going down and the white ships being victorious. Again, we can see that this is a warfare between relatively technologically equal enemies, and the Japanese in many ways are outmaneuvering, outshooting, outgunning their enemy, and in many ways destroying many of their ships. The ships who are not destroyed are going to be taken over by the Japanese and joined into the Navy at that point, at that time. Now, let's get a little bit more into the presentation of the rise of Japan and the fall of China. The depictions of the warfare in these woodblock prints show tall, very, very straight Japanese soldiers wearing immaculately dressed with white pants that are hardly even dirty, taking the land group army's subservience and willingness to cede territory, to cede power to the new triumph, the new Japanese military. And so the Qing army here is presented wearing traditional dress, traditional hats, and bowing in subservience to the Japanese conquerors. The Japanese are straight, as imagined, taller than, of course, the dwarfs that the Chinese have always imagined here, and there's not a single speck of dirt on their white pants in this situation. Japan, the last I know, is one of the great bowing cultures of the world. I very rarely have met Japanese who do not bow in one form or other in honor and respect when talking to other people. So this is a peculiar kind of presentation. When I've presented this to European audiences, they tend to see this as a kind of a racist presentation of the Chinese Manchu troops and the Japanese as superior. I don't see it as that at all. I see it in many ways as the Japanese representing themselves as modern, as westernized, and now up to par with the Western forces at that time. These uniforms are modeled in many ways on German uniforms and French uniforms used after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. So in that situation, this particular presentation of these troops is very, very peculiar. And I think we need to take into account that certainly the Chinese ceded and gave up many of these battles, but whether they occurred in precisely these forms, I think we need to be careful about. Here is a picture of, that Jack London had taken of him in Yalu in 1904, and you can see the white pants aren't there. Clearly the troops are dressed in Western uniforms, but the immaculate white pants are there. It may be that Jack London is not running into officers here, and that the officers are running around in their luxurious white pants. But my suspicion is that the white pants wouldn't have had any use on the battlefield, even in the situation of accepting the surrender of the Qing land troops in this particular situation. This is the more violent one. Let me prepare you for it. This is the one I think that really provoked the students in 2006, and it's something that I think I need to prepare for you, just as I think the MIT people had to prepare more carefully for visualization. This was prepared by the Japanese to trumpet and triumph their victory over the Chinese in 1894-95. It was not meant to be a secret message. It was meant to tell the Japanese how we treated prisoners of war. And this was precisely a period when prisoners of war were beginning to have rights, and armies were having agreements about what to do with prisoners of war. So what do you do with prisoners of war that resist? And in this case, it's interesting that the Japanese had on their hands resisting so-called Manchu forces, Chinese forces. It's unclear whether they're all bannermen or there are Chinese involved. I assume these are bannerman troops in many cases, and they've been recalcitrant, and to teach them all a lesson, the Japanese officers are cutting off their heads, and the blood is flowing. It's a very terrifying scene, and for the Japanese to be presenting this as an ideal for the conquest of China, the conquest of the Qing, I think from our point of view is a troubling one, although we surely ourselves have problems dealing with these issues in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan as well. So I'm not trying to single out the Japanese as the only ones who are perpetrators of this kind of presentation. But I am indicating you can understand why in 2006 students at MIT and at Harvard and elsewhere would be appalled by these kinds of images if they were not presented properly. Again, I'm not presenting this in any way of acceptance of the way the Japanese dealt with their prisoners of war. In many ways, the Japanese will learn enough from these issues, from international discussions, that during the Russo-Japanese War, they will go out of their way to treat prisoners of war with much greater fairness and much greater care. Although there's the argument, the racist argument that they would clearly treat white soldiers that way from Europe, but they wouldn't treat Asian soldiers and others that way, based on the experiences of Second World War, prisoners of war in the Philippines, Indonesia, and in other parts of the Japanese Empire. But nonetheless, this is itself also an optical illusion that we need to be very careful about. The executions took place, but the ballyhooing of it, I can't imagine that they thought that this would become an ideal for a woodblock printer to present. To take some of the edge of that off, we have some images at Princeton of early Republican images that were produced, not to copy Japanese images, but to put together woodblock prints to defend the rise of the Republic and to defend the rise of the Revolutionary Army that defeated the Qing forces. And here, in a different kind of circumstance, we have the Revolutionary Army of the Republic of China beheading criminals and using their queues as an example to sort of indicate that they are to be treated in this kind of way. So this kind of warfare, this kind of treating of prisoners, we also see as a reflection of course, the Chinese learning from the Japanese how to have uniforms, how to dress, how to behave, and ultimately also how to, with military rules and laws, execute prisoners, and in this case, criminals. Now, what I want to conclude with this, in terms of the discussion of the images that we have from the archives in the MIT website, is how the depictions of the naval retreats, the naval losses were represented. On the left, we have the Navy, the Chinese Navy at Weihaiwei giving up to the Japanese Navy, and again, dressed in very traditional clothing. The Japanese dressed, of course, in modern naval uniforms, mimicking the Germans and, of course, the French. And behind the Qing Chinese admirals, we have the American and European advisors also trying to bow in subservience. And again, note the bowing of subservience in contrast to the Japanese standing up ramrod straight, looking at these particular figures. Similarly, at the Treaty for Shimonoseki, we have the Western advisors standing up and discussing the issues with Ito Hirobumi and others, while Li Hongzhang and the others are just sitting there, not even knowing what's going on in this situation. So the Treaty of Shimonoseki was between the advisors of the Qing dynasty and the Japanese generalissimos dressed up with their grand new uniforms of European style, of course, to augment all of their great achievements, both politically and militarily. And in this case, the war is a symbolization of the decrepitude of the Qing, its need of Western advisors, and of the leading voices of Japan being part of this process. Now, again, I want to argue this is an optical illusion. Even if we have photographs of what happened at the peace conference, we still could argue that these issues are not being presented in a fair or factual kind of way. Now, we could make many arguments for why China won and why Japan lost. We've been making those arguments for over a century now. One of the arguments is Japan was open to change. The rapidity of westernization was faster in Japan, a smaller country. Samurai warlike traditions, warrior traditions versus civilian ideals would have mattered. The economic arguments, a lack of corruption in Japan versus an endemic corruption in China. The science and technology argument, which I've given center of place here, the quicker firing guns, the Japan surprise attack, for example, at Yalu, the Japanese didn't declare war. In modern warfare, you're supposed to declare war. Well, the Japanese weren't the first to do that, and the issue came up at the 1883-84 war between France and China, when France didn't declare war and just invaded the Fuzhou fleet and bombed them. And from that, the Japanese learned that one didn't have to abide by the great laws of the 10,000 states, that one could, in many ways, win effectively by defying those rules and laws. And so one of the advantages that the Japanese also had was attacking without premeditation. And so in that situation, though, the Americans in particular should know this and understand this based on Pearl Harbor, that attacking without declaring war has certain advantages to you. It set back the American effort in the Pacific by several months, if not several years, in trying to deal with these kinds of issues. So that's certainly one issue you want to take in. And I'll return to the indemnities, and that will be the end of this particular story. I figured this out when the yen was about 110 to the dollar. It's now about 85, so it would be even more now. This is roughly 200 million Kuping's silver taels, which would come to about 745 million kilograms, equal to about $3.8 billion, coming in 1895. Not all at once, of course. This would be 2 to 3 times the annual Japanese government revenue of that period of time. It was a windfall profit, and it made possible a whole range of other developments in Japan, the development of the arms for the new ships, and other economic necessities for Japan in this period of time. Add the Boxer indemnity, and of course this is money taken from the Qing and given to Japan. The self-strengthening movement, of course, has no funds. It had more funds than the Japanese did in the 1870s and 1880s for the Changnan Arsenal, for the Fuzhou shipyard, but now in the 1890s into the early 20th century, the Japanese have much more economic resources than the Chinese do for their efforts. So I think we need to bring this into the equation and evaluate these kinds of issues. So China's failure and Japan's success based on this warfare, I would suggest, is not so simple as a simple-minded rise of Japan and fall of China, when in fact the rise of Japan is implicated in the fall of China in this period of time. Now I'd like to return to Mark Tansey just to finish off this narrative discussion and show how art, the woodblock prints of Japan, can be read in a funny kind of way to look at the remnants of Second World War. Mark Tansey's The Triumph of the New York School, 1984, is a remarkable portrayal of the rise of New York as a center of art. After the Second World War, after the destructions of Europe, the fall of Germany, the embarrassments of France, England, of course, bombed quite a bit, that in this context, the warfare has signaled a rise of New York as the artistic center precisely because of the victory on the battlefield that the Americans, by not suffering any major losses at home, have been able to gain in this warfare. And in this picture that Tansey portrays, we have the Europeans in First World War garb fighting underground in foxholes versus the Americans fighting above ground with their Second World War II uniforms, accepting the surrender of the Europeans. And it's a very funny kind of painting, and similar to the other one I showed you. Here, Pablo Picasso, who's irate over this, he's not going to see the art history world moving toward New York rather than to Europe. Salvador Dali doesn't seem to care very much. He's smoking a cigarette by the side. Clement Greenberg, Jackson Pollock, and others, as Americans, have their hands in their pockets, aw shucks, kinds of perspectives, and they're accepting this domination in this context as sort of given, and that we need to evaluate this transformation based on an artistic battle. So art is represented through warfare here. It didn't happen that way, or did it? Depends on your interpretation. And I'm suggesting to you that if we looked at that earlier art about the surrender of the Chinese to the Japanese in woodblock prints, there's a similar kind of artistic freedom that's involved, and that inside that artistic freedom, we see certain messages being presented that in many ways, yes, warfare and new perspectives go together, and that the fall of China and the rise of Japan is in part made possible, empowered by particularly the Sino-Japanese War and particularly the Russo-Japanese War that occurs thereafter. And that we can see it in our home areas in terms of the way Mark Tansey spoofs postmodernism to show the rise of the New York School to be a military victory and nothing more than that. Now, this, I'm afraid that the slide is not very, very clear, but there was a recent exhibition at the MoMA in New York about the painters that have just been described accepting the surrender of the Europeans. And the narrative is a very interesting one. Let me try to read at least part of it to you. Here it says, with a grave intensity and sense of responsibility, the Americans, who would later become known as the abstract expressionists, set out to make art that would reassert the highest ideals of humankind. Historical circumstance afforded them an advantage. Wartime events had made New York City the one place in the world open for the business of modern art. Exiled artists and art dealers filled the city. Indeed, this museum, with the most advanced work of the time and local artists, had front row seats. They were readying themselves to occupy center stage. It's an interesting artistic narrative, but it's very unlikely that the painters were seeing it in those kinds of words and arguments, but this was based on a recent account at the MoMA being presented this way. So I'm not putting this out simply for an understanding of Japan or China, but in many ways, these images allow us the assumption, or at least the belief, that the Americans are superior because of our moral superiority as a result of this particular war. Fenollosa, as many of you know, and Okakura Tenjin began to build these kinds of arguments into their understanding of Chinese art in the late 19th, early 20th century. Chinese art had failed, along with the rest of Chinese civilization. I won't go into it in any great detail here, but let me just simply read that but if we adopt any high universal test of aesthetic attainment, great spacing, great characterization, and the structural use of great color, we shall find modern Chinese paintings to have fallen almost to the childish point of awkward weakness and ineffective symbolism, the same point to which the European Christian art fell to in the poorest of Byzantine mosaics. And then the telling lines, the only hope for the hopeless is to perceive itself to be hopeless. We may then come to discard it and begin anew. Let us not really lower our critical standards to suit a degenerate present. This is on after the Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, and this perspective is written in as if it is accepted and as if it is universal. We can all laugh now. We say similar things about our own situation today that people will laugh about in 50 years from now in terms of our perspectives. So I think we need to sort of have some distance for this. But Fenollosa and Okakura Tenjin made a living out of doing art history by portraying a failed China, a failed art. Add to that history, the rise of the Song dynasty and the demise of the Ming and Qing as historically viable dynasties, and we begin to see that a good deal of our understanding of late imperial China, the Ming and Qing, has been encoded with a good many Japanese messages from the great scholars of Japan who have influenced our fields of Song history, Ming and Qing history as well. That this narrative from the most knowledgeable of Chinese history, from the most knowledgeable of Chinese art history, they were much more knowledgeable than we were until quite recently, that these narratives in many ways began to be provoked and pointed in a session praising the Japanese superiority. Victoria Weston's recent account summarizes this as arguing they saw China as a subjugated and a fractured political entity, and in many ways saw art history as an effort to encode that particular failure. Well, a good many of our narratives have been failure narratives ever since. They enter into our narratives of production. Here we see the colonel defeating hordes of Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, making its way into the 1894 issue of the San Francisco Chronicle. This is almost like a Run Run Shaw movie made in Hong Kong, where one person can subdue hundreds at a single blow with a single sword in that situation. And we also see from Punch an interesting perspective on this from the sideline, the Goliath of China versus the dwarf samurai soldier from Japan. Who would win? Of course, the faster, quicker samurai versus the bigger but slower, stodgier Goliath would lose. These perspectives, of course, also give us a sense of the misperceptions, the optical illusions that we all accepted as some sort of sense of reality of the time in that context. John Fryer and others John Fryer had spent 30 years in China, in Shanghai, translating materials for the Jiangnan Arsenal and for the schools that he helped establish there. And then he decided in 1895 to go to Berkeley College. And he sent a letter to the president of Berkeley College, Kellogg at that time, explaining why he was leaving his life's work in China. And he said in his letter to Kellogg, these survive at the Berkeley archives of the Fryer collection, "Of course, this looks to the general decay of the Chinese language and literature, and with them the comparative uselessness of my many years of labor. Their doom seems to be inevitable, for only the fittest can survive. Note the social Darwinism that has entered into the narrative of a Christian missionary in the late 19th century. It may take many generations to accomplish, but sooner or later the end must come, and English be the learned language of the empire." Well, certainly English is important, but Chinese seems to be doing very well, and so-called Chinese characters, a kanji or whatever, are also seeming to do very well in the new global age of websites and electronic information. So Fryer was dead wrong, but you can see the perspectives of 1895 began to see a period of the end of China, the demise of China, the fall of China, and where should China go. And I would add to that, Chinese began to accept that. And here we begin to see an important transition for the failure narrative of China coming out of a triumph narrative for Japan. Revolutionaries, after all, need a failed past. Revolutionaries need a failed country to revolutionize. And so in many ways, the Japanese and other accounts were providing the beginning reformers and the beginning revolutionaries with a failed China that must be revolutionized. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument of whether the revolution was inevitable or not, absolutely essential or not, but you can see that the beginning of the argument is China had failed so miserably in the Ming and Qing, particularly in the late Qing, that we needed and must have a revolution. And Japan, in many ways, helped build those kinds of arguments and helped support reformers and revolutionaries by taking them in as giving them havens after 1898 and certainly in other periods as well. Of course, if one says that the revolution required these kinds of narratives, well, that begins to question the narratives themselves and makes you wonder whether the narratives had that kind of objective cosmological power that meant that the revolution was inevitable, or maybe it wasn't all that simple. And maybe we have been snookered by a revolution in the 20th century that took itself into its own framework and argued that things were inevitable. Here, Feng Youlan, in 1922, coming to work at Columbia, begins the great argument that China has failed in science. There is no science in China. And he argues, for example, here in this article answering Dewey about what's the problem with China, what keeps China back is that she has no science. And we have for a generation been arguing that with Needham and others about why China failed to develop modern science. And because of that tremendous focus of manpower on that particular interesting heuristic question, we know very little about modern science as it actually evolved in modern China, and certainly since 1949. We have so many people working on the failures in the Ming Dynasty, the failures in the Qing Dynasty, that we don't have a sense of what happened in the Republican period and the beginnings of the rise of industry and science in the 20s and 30s under the Republic and the Kuomintang, and the rise of the sciences in the 50s and 60s. There are just a handful of people doing research on those subjects. Yet I can give you a host of people associated with Needham and others working on the failure narrative for Chinese science, as if there wasn't any. And we, of course, now understand there was quite a bit in the 1860s, 1870s, based on the translation work of Fryer and the others that we would want to deal with. So in that context, I think I probably will want to stop shortly. I don't want to go on too long, but I wanted to present to you a sense of the failure narrative as something common sense, and I hope by now I can help you to see that it was constructed. Constructed with a great deal of Japanese expertise, of the Japanese influence on sinology, and I'm an example of that influence. Has been pervasive. Many of us have studied Chinese history in Japan, and the narratives of Miyazaki, Chisada, Yoshikawa Kojiro, and the others fill our narratives in Song history, Ming and Qing history. And those narratives, as excellent and as worthwhile as they are, came packaged with a whole range of assumptions and feelings about Japan vis-a-vis China after 1894-95. And what I want to do tomorrow and Friday, we'll try to look at those issues without this narrative, this heritage of this narrative, the weight of this narrative weighing us down to see things, to predict things, and to see things in only new ways. The reasons why China never developed science, the reason why China never developed democracy, the reason why China never developed capitalism, go on and on, often develops into its own kind of cottage industry, And I won't go through each one of these. Each of them is plausible in its own kind of way, and many of you have used them. I misled a generation of students at UCLA arguing these kinds of issues until I began to realize that if all of this were true, there shouldn't be anything in China. And yet there is so much. And that one of the ironies of Needham's work is, even if his arguments are questionable, the weight of the volumes of the information in them is enough to make sure you don't want to be under them when they come down. There's so much information and problem in there. So I think we need to sort of come to grips with the issues. Can we really remember a time when it was argued the Chinese had no merchants? Granet's ancient view of the Shang dynasty became normative in the 20th century for arguing the Chinese are anti-mercantile, which of course they are ideologically, but that didn't mean there weren't any merchants the way Granet argued for the Shang dynasty. How we would have taken those kinds of arguments seriously and used them for our particular perspectives gives you some sort of cautionary tale about how we should view our own scholarship today in trying to make sense of many of these issues and problems. And certainly omniscience is one of our traits. Whether we are frogs or whether we're crabs viewing things backwards, omniscience is not one of our traits. And I think we need to be very careful about reading into these narratives any sense of omniscience, including omniscience about the revolution in the 20th century as inevitable or otherwise. Now, new perspectives is what I hope to open with tomorrow. What happens when we undo this narrative? When the narrative of decline of China and rise of Japan, things become very hard. You now need new answers. And so some of the answers I'm going to propose beginning on small-scale subjects tomorrow and the day after will be efforts to learn how to walk again without these huge techniques, methodologies that we have in place to tell our undergraduates how things really were in the period of the 1894-95 war. When we undo that narrative and we get through that fog and see how much we have been manipulated by many of these issues, I think we begin to see that it's very hard to figure out what to do next and how to proceed next in these issues. These narratives will remain dominant for a long period of time, but what I'm going to suggest is we need a new starting point to get back to beginnings as beginnings without the insufferable endings suffocating them. And one of the areas you might say, let's go back to the Grand Armada of Zheng He. And I think that's the worst possible argument. This has been turned into a science fiction movie by Gavin Menzies, where the Chinese have landed in Rhode Island, have gone across the Atlantic, and gone to Australia. It's precisely the opposite of the other narrative. Rather than the failure narrative, it's the kind of Disneyland version of China from the Ming Dynasty of what might have been. And I would suggest, whether Fujian likes it or not, or Gavin Menzies receives warm welcomes in Fujian when he makes these arguments, that it is pure science fiction, and our solution is not to go to a great and greater China and make a smaller and smaller Japan in this particular story. It's much more complicated than that. And where I will want to start tomorrow is the first Japanese war, Sino-Japanese war, at least in modern times, when Hideyoshi invaded Korea. It's a remarkable war. And we won't go into any detail today, but it's roughly comparable in terms of numbers and in terms of technologies to the Spanish Armada invading England and, of course, falling at the hands of the great kamikaze of the North Sea in that period of time. All of you know about the Spanish Armada. I suspect most of us have forgotten about Hideyoshi, except those of us who are specialists of Warring States Japan and early Tokugawa Japan and where Tokugawa comes from in that kind of situation. So tomorrow I'd like to begin with the first Sino-Japanese war and see how things look from that point of view as of the 1590s forward, rather than looking, as I did today, from 1894-95 backwards. 1894-95 means everything failed. Confucianism failed, the state failed, the society failed, there were too many people, all kinds of things enter into that kind of powerful narrative. And what I want to do tomorrow is begin to build Humpty Dumpty back up again. The metaphor of Humpty Dumpty is a very good one in terms of postmodernism and its impacts. How do we build it back together again after Humpty Dumpty has fallen down? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. As someone myself who spent a fair amount of my graduate training in Japan, this notion of the effects of Japanese histories of China and being packaged in this larger narrative of Japan's relationship to China is certainly something I've thought about, not quite in the way that you've put it today, though, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about how this teleology of failure will be rewritten, how Humpty Dumpty will be put back together again. I thought Humpty Dumpty couldn't be put back together again, but you will show that we're wrong about that.
No, I think the same thing as the Grand Canyon can't be put together.
Our discussant today, I'm very happy to say, is Professor John Dower of MIT, now Professor Emeritus. Professor Dower is well known to many of us here. He taught at MIT for a good 20 years. Before that was also at the University of California, but in San Diego. And prior to that, at Madison at the University of Wisconsin. Professor Dower's books are, again, almost every one is a prize-winning book. I won't mention them all here. The best one, I think the best known one to all of us, is Embracing Defeat, published in 1999, which won him a Pulitzer Prize, the Bancroft Prize, the National Book Award, the Fairbank Prize, and other prizes as well for the Japanese version of that book. He is, of course, also one of the creative figures behind the Visualizing Cultures exhibition, online images that Professor Ellman referred to, and which, like today's lecture, the Reischauer Institute, together with the Fairbanks Center, will be helping to co-sponsor in May this year, a weekend symposium. Professor Dower, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you for letting me join you. I was brought in really because I was the one who wrote the unit that caused the controversy in 2006. Visualizing Cultures is a site that my colleague Shigeru Miyagawa and I created in 2002. And this month, April 2011, is the 5th anniversary of the incident, which I hadn't realized until it all came together today. It's not a happy recollection. And I thought that what I can do mostly in the paper that Professor Ellman submitted that I read, he had spent much more time on the site and on the Chinese students' response to it, and trying to understand the rationality or the understandability of that response. And I thought perhaps what I could best do is just speak from my own perspective on the use of these images, on the narratives that they were presenting, what Professor Ellman has called optical illusions, which is a very interesting phrase. I guess I was looking at as propaganda of the Sino-Japanese War in plainer terms. But I wanted to talk about several things here, and I wanted to talk about the incident because the incident resonates with us today. Visualizing Cultures was created by Professor Miyagawa and I. The thrust of it is simply that we can use now as historians and scholars, we can use graphics as texts. That is to say, we read them as we would the written word as scholars. And what we can do now, the reason why we are doing this now is because technologically we can make these materials available to teachers, to scholars, to students in ways we never could do. I'm of the generation where you copied things from a book with your own camera and showed slides in the classroom. It's a totally different world there now. And one of the notions was we could weave together the images and an analytical text. When we were doing this in the early in the early 10 years ago when we started to do this, there was quite a bit of notion that you really couldn't do this because that's not what people using the web could do. But the notion was we could make materials available, we could do this in ways that had never been done, and you don't censor what you put up. You do not ever try to distort the nature or real thrust of the database. When we came to the unit that caused such consternation and more than consternation, it was a very, very harsh moment. The unit that went up was called Throwing Off Asia, and it had 3 parts. Throwing Off Asia was, and I wrote the narratives, and it's very clear I wrote the narratives. I want to make that point clear. You'll see why in a moment. But my name is on all of them. It comes from Fukuzawa Yukichi's Datsuadon. Throwing off Asia was the notion that Japan would throw off traditional ways and westernize and modernize. And so that's where we took it, and we had several parts to the unit. The first part, and what we did was we saw at that point in making the sites that if you can identify collections that are really valuable for scholars and put them online, that we thought that was a contribution. And what we did at that point was identify a collection at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston called the Schaff Collection of Meiji Woodblock Prints. Professor Ellman mentioned that there had been some exhibitions of these prints from the Meiji period and of the war prints and the Sino-Japanese war prints. There were a few small catalogs, but they really hadn't been seen unless you were really in the know and had the catalogs in your hands. The Schaff collection consists of about 800 Meiji woodblock prints. It's one of the best in the world. What we did was digitize 250 of those 800. I'm sorry, we put up in digitized form 250 of those images. 150 the MFA had in its internal computer files. The other 100, I asked the MFA, I had gone through the whole collection, will you digitize these for us to use on visualizing cultures? And they said yes. So we came up with 250 prints, which basically hadn't been seen very much, and some had never been digitized before. And it went up in 3 units under Throwing Off Asia. One was the usual westernization prints, in Japan, the modern buildings, the fashions and dress, the promulgation of the Constitution, the opening of the Diet, the emperor prints, and so on. The second was the Sino-Japanese War, which becomes the controversy. And the third was the Russo-Japanese War, though there were 3 units up. The themes, I think, were complex because my own feeling is when you read the images, we can draw many, many things out of them, as Professor Ellman was doing with you, with the things he was showing. But the themes that we wanted to introduce, I was trying to introduce, was that throwing off Asia, basically, as Fukuzawa meant, it was throwing off the traditional ways of the past, and it became, of course, literal with the attack on China. But the point was Meiji westernization included not just the parliament, not just rule of law, not just Bummei Kaika, Western fashions. It also meant Western-style imperialism, the rich country, the strong nation, the imperialist power. And the point of the Sino-Japanese War unit was that this induced a frenzy of nationalism in Japan. And you could see it in the prints that Professor Ellman used, some of which, the ones that came from visualizing cultures, the Western uniforms, the Western posture, the clear identification with the West rather than Asia, represented by China, comes off strongly. And I also, one of the points of the unit was to make the point that the Sino-Japanese War marked the moment when Japanese denigration of China and the Chinese rose to stunning levels. That was one of the points of the unit. Levels of violence, levels of hatred, levels of denigration, levels of racial, outright racist contempt. Now, the unit, the execution unit that caused the controversy, and this is where I'd like to just give you a little context for the way the controversy looked from our perspective. Because of the way we did things, that image was surrounded by text. And it was, in fact, part of a whole image where we had developed various aspects of the prints. And it was called The Devil in the Details section, and it was dealing explicitly with very harsh and even atrocious images. I'm not going to go online. This was the image in the as it appeared in the unit, and then immediately following that is the text. I just want to read you what the text said. Even today, over a century later, this contempt for the Chinese remains shocking. Simply as racial stereotyping alone, it was as disdainful of the Chinese as anything that can be found in anti-so-called Oriental racism in the United States and Europe at the time. As if the process of westernization had entailed for the Japanese, adopting the white man's imagery while excluding themselves from it. This poisonous seed, already planted in violence in 1894 to 95, would burst into full atrocious flower 4 decades later, when the emperor's soldiers and sailors once again launched war against China. Ironically, the Japanese propaganda that accompanied that later war involved throwing off the West and embracing Pan-Asianism, but that is another story. There's much more text like that. So that was the point of what was going on there. And in the paper that I read of Professor Ellman's earlier paper, I don't think he mentioned it today, he said when he saw the site, he thought, well, if there's going to be a reaction against it, it's going to come from the right wing in Japan. And that was my expectation also. I assume that if there's going to be some kind of a protest, it'll come from the right wing in Japan, because these were really, and we have many such images. That's the by far the most horrifying, but there are many. And I also thought that that would be the case, that the Great War that puts them on the path of the victory narrative would be the one that was being challenged. And it didn't happen. And we did have a very, very harsh response, began in MIT grad students who went into the site 6 months later because there had been a little thing on the MIT website saying, here's an interesting MIT project. A couple of Chinese grad students at MIT went in, sent us emails, sent Professor Miyagawa emails saying, this is very disturbing, and Professor Miyagawa answered them immediately. But what they did was they went viral. And what happened was that within moments, and this is a fascinating window on the world we live in now. The world we live in is just not the world I grew up in when I began teaching, or when I was coming to the end of teaching. It's just a different world. It went viral. What was done was that single image, the execution image, was lifted out of the site, put online with Chinese text around it, and the Chinese text said, MIT professors think this is beautiful art. And that went viral. That went viral. So what you weren't getting was a response to the site. You were getting a response to the way in which a really horrendous image, which I wrote, this is really horrendous, was lifted and said, we think this is beautiful art. And essentially no one really looked at the site during the controversy. What they were, those who did look at the site did not read the text. This is the world out there. And when it's visual, you skim, you scan, you browse, you pick up what you want. So it became an issue that was divorced from the larger thing of what we were doing, and it was highly orchestrated, because once it went out there, it became picked up by organized groups, and Professor Miyagawa eventually retrieved everything that was out there, because this is what you can do with email. I hope you all know that. It never goes away. And so you could reconstruct all of this. And so an orchestrated campaign went on that immediately engulfed the United States. It took about 6 hours, I think, between those initial emails and this becoming a nationwide incident. And this is where I would talk about things that didn't come up in Professor Ellman's talk. My first point is that the image is isolated. The second is that the response is then orchestrated. The response targeted Professor Miyagawa, not me. And it was unbelievably, viciously violent and racist. I had to observe this taking place. It didn't target on me. The site had on it, for information about the site, contact Professor Miyagawa, and they gave his email. But the site has my name as the author. I will not repeat to you what was in the emails. It showed a very, very good command of the crudest of English language invective and racist invective. It was sheer racism of the crudest sort. He was targeted by email and by phone, and then it extended to where he received a death threat to him, and they posted online Professor Miyagawa's home address, home phone number, and names of his children. And by this time, and I was there, I had to watch this happening to him. By that time, the MIT police were in on it, and his house was put under police protection for a number of days. In the meanwhile, an orchestrated campaign was conducted to deluge the president of the university, the deans, and both of our departments, demanding that both of us be fired from the university. So this was the circumstances in which, and Professor Ellman talks about this a little more in the earlier draft, we took down the site temporarily. Now, the other point that obviously is taking place, this is 2006, it's taking place in the context of Chinese nationalism in general, and the rise in anti-Japanese targeting in Chinese contemporary nationalism. And that goes into your narratives in general in the biggest way. So this became the moment of this that we were then pulled in, and we had those meetings. And we had a meeting with the students, 100 grad students at least. The room was packed. Mostly grad students from MIT and Harvard. They were enraged. I won't go into the details. Then we later worked with the Chinese Association at MIT to try to cool it. Meanwhile, it was viral. It was all over the PRC. It had been picked up in at least 200 media outlets in the US. And then here I want to make one very important point. Professor Ellman spoke of the understandable response of the Chinese to this. Often they would say they were hurt. And I understand that. We understood that very well. We understood how you can be hurt by these images. And we sympathized with that. But in the room and in those emails and in those phone calls, the university police monitored all our emails and phone calls. I wasn't on email, but they monitored all our phone calls for, I don't know, a couple of weeks because they took the threats seriously. In that meeting, no one stood up in the entire community to defend what we were doing or try to give it context. And it was clear from the meeting no one had read my text. That was very clear, that no one had read the text. And we were basically accused of supporting, thinking this was great art. When the meeting ended, and this is important, you cannot speak of the Chinese students. You cannot homogenize them. They are very diverse. Students came up to us after the meeting saying, I'm sorry, this has gotten out of hand. Shortly in the days that followed, a graduate student at MIT came up. I've lost track. I don't even know her name or anything. She asked for the transcript of the entire unit so she could translate it into Chinese to put it online. There was a student that had gotten a PhD, a woman from Beijing who got a PhD in political science at MIT, had taken a number of classes with me, had brand new teacher at her first job far away in the US, wrote me a letter saying, can I come up? Should I come up? Is there anything I can do to intercede? And then Chinese journalists began picking it up and took it seriously and offered us opportunities to have interviews. And it became a debate online in China, and became a debate. And there were people saying, this is a crazy response. This is a crazy response. It went to the Chinese alumni of MIT who naturally were concerned. Do you really have professors that are saying this is beautiful art? And they were persuaded no, and so they came out and spoke against the students. And so you got a sense of what was, of the complexity of that and of a kind of a frenzy that can build up. And it was sobering. It was sobering. There were people in the room waving Iris Chang's book, Rape of Nanjing. When I got up to speak, I teach Japanese history. I was asked, have you ever heard of the Rape of Nanking? It was sort of like the Little Red Book. But the passion was great. The passion was enormous. The hatred was enormous. The inability, there was a notion that's different from what we do as historians. There was a real notion in the room that if you put up an image, you must approve of the image. I hadn't even thought of that level. If you use it, that must show that you support it. Well, let me just wrap. How did we respond to this? I think Professor Ellman's correct. We're always rethinking these narratives, and we're full of illusions that are optical and every other kind of illusions, and that's what we do. But just in practical terms, we had to respond. We took it down. We meaning MIT, and I remember the moment very vividly. It was when and I saw him when he got the call saying, death threat to his family. That you don't want to see that to someone you're very close to or to anyone. We took it down, and we've never been clear in our minds whether we should have or not, because what was up was the execution picture. That was still up there. I think there's some lessons here. You can never prevent deliberate manipulation. When you work online, you can never prevent deliberate manipulation, but you can try to prevent misunderstanding. Interesting things happen. For example, some of the Chinese students, with thinking they were being more moderate, said, you must at least delete that picture and any pictures like it. And I was thunderstruck. I said, you want me to sanitize what the Japanese were doing at the time? You see, I mean, it was just, we're in a world where we don't understand what's going on. But it just never occurred to me, you cannot censor what you deal with. So you've got to try to prevent misunderstanding to the extent possible. What we did, and if you go into the site now, we did not change a single image. Every image in there are the images that were up there. We did not change a single word of the text that was up there. So if you want to go up there and read the main text, that is what was up there when the incident occurred. What we did do was write and feel a need to write introductory statement of what it means to use historical materials and what it means to use materials that may be hurtful, and why we must do it if we're trying to do serious work and serious understanding. And we were, and the statement was translated into 7 languages: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, German, French, Spanish, I think. Saying what seemed obvious but wasn't obvious. We put up one of those little blinking lights that says, warnings, images, some images may be disturbing to see. It's not what you expect to have to do in academia, but we're working in a different milieu. Most important thing I think that we did, not just simply to the site, but in our thinking is, in working online, you've got to understand people don't read all the stuff. They look at the pictures, they skim. And what we were doing was putting just simple metadata under the caption, you know, the title of the picture, the artist, and the date it was published. And you've got to, particularly when you've made the point in the main body of the text, if it's a subtle point or a delicate issue, you've got to work it in the caption so it's wrapped around and right there to be seen. Well, we've done a lot more sites since 26. There's quite a few sites now up on China. At the same time, we're very committed to this ideal, and I think academics must be committed. It's what's known as the Creative Commons ideal, that we put up things and can be shared by everyone. Anything that we put up can be downloaded, which requires lots of negotiations and lawyers and everything. Everything online can be downloaded. But I think the real lesson that I take away, perhaps, besides occasional despair, is that we academics, we people working online, have to take optimal care to avoid censoring or sanitizing the historical record. And that's not just VC. I think that's the task and the responsibility of the historian. So that's some of the things I take away from that incident.
If we needed any reminder of the importance of bringing together a discussion of narratives of Chinese history and narratives of Japanese history, I think that the story that Professor Dower has given us, familiar to many of us, but perhaps not to all of us before today, is a very salutary reminder of that importance, something that lies very much behind what the Reischauer lectures are really all about. Remind us also that although we tend to think of ourselves safely ensconced in our ivory tower here, that all history is political ultimately, and it doesn't take much, especially not today, for things that we say, things that we write, images that we have uploaded to the net to go out of our control, and they become very, very powerful indeed, frighteningly so. And all of these narratives, I think, narratives of failure, narratives of success, victimhood, and so forth, require great care. Let me open the floor for questions. I wonder if we might turn the lights up just a bit make it a little bit easier for me to identify folks in the audience. Please. Great. And if you could please identify yourself before you begin to speak. That'd be great.
I'm
Thank you.
Luke Lee from Peking University, waiting for at the Fairbank Center. I want to have a question for Professor Martin. Do you think your interpretive is a kind of comparative history interpret is a kind of master narrative in the West? It's different with maybe the Chinese narrative. That's my question. Thank you. Do you think it's a kind of master narrative in the West? The comparative analysis between Japan and the Chinese.
This is a question for Professor Ellman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think in many ways, the revolutionaries internalized this narrative of failure. And I think in some ways, the images that we've been discussing enabled revolutionaries to say, this is what's wrong with us. This is what we have to do to change. So ironically, the revolutionaries wanted as much of a failed China as possible to develop. I think that narrative of a failed China is slowly but surely changing. You can see it, for example, in the changing movies about the Opium War. The initial Opium War portrayed the Qing government as complicit in their own demise, corrupt and backward, whereas the more recent explanations of the Qing government in the Opium War is of brave men that were outgunned by the British fleet and the like. So I think we see some changing narratives. And I think a number of the Chinese students that I've talked to and worked with in the early 21st century are not even aware of many of these narratives, that they're not very conscious of them. And when they see these images, it's neither something that a revolutionary can get upset about and make use of, or it's something that they themselves would accept and say, this is why we have to change. So I think it's a very complicated kind of issue, and Professor Dower is right to say there are many different kinds of Chinese students that are involved in this. But I will say that the contemporary Chinese students are being educated in a different kind of way about these kinds of issues, and certainly the Sino-Japanese issues are being presented differently in China than they're being presented here, particularly much more sensitive political times. I think the current issue, I think, with regard to the earthquake in Japan and with the Sichuan earthquake in China, there was a good deal of discussion back and forth and help from the Japanese for the Sichuan victims, and now the Chinese have helped the victims of the Sendai earthquake and the Northeast earthquake. So there are different kinds of changes. But I think the larger trajectories is what I think I'm trying to warn about in the 21st century. A Japan that can no longer take for granted its leadership in Asia, and a China that aspires to that leadership, and all these different groups claiming victory or we are the rising power, and the dangers of that issue. I think I'm not arguing, for example, that the rise of Japan should be succeeded by the rise of China. In fact, I'm warning about the rise of China as a narrative that many of us have bought into and somehow assume that by 2020 or 2030, China will be the most productive economy and all the rest of this in the world. Per capita, China will never be the most productive economy in the world in our lifetimes or for the foreseeable future because of the 1.3 billion people. So I think we need to be very careful how we evaluate these kinds of issues and deal with them. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I would agree with you that Chinese have a different perspective on this. I will say, for example, that when I give this talk or something similar to this in China, what disturbs people are less the images than the claims that the revolution wasn't inevitable, and that people see the revolution as being endangered in this narrative. And initially I didn't think I was saying that, but now I think I realize why it's being interpreted that way in China, that revolutionaries made use of these issues, whether for good or bad, whether truth or optical illusions or not, and that the revolution, if it loses its credibility, then what was the revolution for? What was the Communist Party for? It opens up these areas of questioning that I've begun to have to deal with in China.
Professor Tai.
You've done a very good job of showing that the outcome of the Sino-Japanese War was not at all predictable. It could have gone the other way. Had it gone the other way, then perhaps the narrative of Japan's rise would not have been so dominant. However, it's not impossible that the narrative of China's decline would still have been available, because there was this history of, since the Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion, the various rebellions of the 1860s and 70s that showed that China was very weak. So perhaps not the Sino-Japanese War, but some other confrontation would have produced a kind of narrative that made Chinese convinced that they needed to change their society altogether. So what I would suggest is that we might want to decouple the idea of Japan's rise and China's fall.
I would agree with you, except that it takes for granted the notion of a declining China in the 19th century. And I think if we look very carefully at the self-strengthening movement in the Yangwundong and take away the Japanese, getting $4.5 billion from the Chinese government for its own development, and that being used in the Jiangnan arsenal, being used in the Fuzhou shipyard, being used in the Hankou mining areas and the like, that the results would have been very, very different. We're talking hypothetically about what didn't happen. China lost the war, paid the reparations, and all these other things could have happened. But I think if we look carefully, had China won that war, I think it probably wouldn't have happened if Japan had known that the Fuzhou fleet was going to join the Beiyang fleet. They probably wouldn't have attacked. But they knew that they wouldn't, that there was a division in power, and so they attacked and took advantage of it. And given all the things that happened afterwards, I think Japan's role is implicit in the decline of China, more so than I think your effort to decouple gives it credit for. So it isn't that China and Japan are in a race and we decouple, that Japan in many ways is inflicting damage on China in many ways that makes the Chinese development story more complicated. So I think decoupling, it doesn't make it, you can't decouple and make it a kind of a Japan rise, China rise or fall are separate. The Japanese are implicit in the problem. And I think we can't take that away from it, given the issues of what brought down the self-strengthening movement. Now, the Harvard School has been very famous for writing on the Yangwu Yundong, the so-called self-strengtheners, and talking about failure narratives in that particular issue. By looking at it in the 1880s, 1890s, most of the literature of the time and the writings of the New York, of the Herald, the Shanghai Herald, and all the rest of it indicates that they were doing quite well, that they were at least succeeding, that the Chinese Navy was larger and perhaps even technologically more advanced than the Japanese Navy, and the Japanese were unsure about certain things. At the various incidents in Taiwan in the 1870s and other incidents over the Ryukyus, it was unclear how that would work out, and Japanese superiority wasn't that clear. So I think 1894-95 is an important kind of threshold for the beginnings of this.
At the risk of mischaracterizing Bill Kirby's position on this, I think he would agree with you. In fact, one of his recent articles has stated pretty plainly that if not for the Japanese, we would not have seen the Communist Revolution of 1949 succeed. He's given that very, very great weight in some of his work.
I think Chalmers Johnson argued that a long time ago.
Right. Other questions? Yes, in the back. Oh, okay. I didn't see Professor Gordon, and then, yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. Andrew Gordon in the History Department. These were two fabulously important and valuable presentations, and I have questions and thoughts on each, but I'll focus on the Professor Ellman's talk. And my concern or question, and maybe you'll say that I'm going to answer it tomorrow and the next day, in which case maybe you can give a preview, but is that I'm hearing less of a denial of the validity or value of talking about history in terms of rise and fall, as I'm hearing a refiguring of how that narrative would be told, in that you're saying that you should just bring the two experiences more close together in their mutual implications. And that may be, I find that very persuasive as an argument in many ways, including the particular examples you gave. But I also see it as something that almost inevitably then feeds into some further telling of a more recent story in terms of rising and falling. And so how, and I don't have, I'm not like a lawyer where you go into court and ask a question where you know the answer. I don't have an answer to this. It's troubling me, but if you have thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I'm hoping to do some of this, as you said, Thursday and Friday on a different kind of level. In the end, no one should leave the room thinking that China won the Sino-Japanese War. They lost. I mean, they lost decisively. The Japanese took Port Arthur and then, of course, had to give it back. And the Russians took it over, and that was the thing that the Meiji Emperor was most chagrined about, is to having to swallow, without a single battle, giving up the jewel of the campaign. So in that sense, the Japanese won the war, the Chinese lost the war, and I don't think that's going to change. I don't want anybody to think that I've turned night into day or today into night. That happened. But the reasons for it and the issues and debates about it, I think, are things we have to worry about. I think the rise and fall issues are coming much later than we might have expected, that they're not being read into the Tokugawa period, they're not being read into the Dutch learning period, they're being read into events that are closer and closer to the 1890s, 1880s, 1870s, 1860s perhaps. So I think demarcating it and coming up with a stronger narrative. As I said, I de-teleologize, but I also re-teleologize. And I think of the teleologies, I think I'm offering the beginnings of a new form of a teleology that many others hopefully will contribute to, but we're going to have to come to grips with the early teleology. And among those re-teleologies, China loses the Sino-Japanese War. Japan wins that and also wins the Russo-Japanese War. The historical record is quite clear about those issues. So I think your sense of retelling in terms of the remaining aspects of the rise and fall. What was the rise? What was the fall? Was culture involved? Was art involved? All these other issues are more complicated, and I think we can locate rise and fall more in, often as a cultural historian, warfare represents a whole frame of economic imperatives that the Chinese lose in giving up billions of dollars, billions of silver coins to the Japanese in that war. So I agree with you, but I think we get a better narrative. Not a final narrative either, but a better narrative as we rethink these earlier narratives.
All right. There's a question in the back here, I think.
Hung, I'm a first-year PhD student here. I don't know how I missed the event in 2006, but having heard it for the first time here, it's indeed the reaction of the Chinese students is very baffling. But I was wondering, had the image showed up for the first time in a Chinese website, probably the assumption when someone look at the page would not have been that the author of the page approved of this image. So I wonder if embedded in this reaction is also this constructed assumption of the position of the West or the role of the West. And I was really fascinated by one of the images that Professor Allman put up, which is, I think, from the Punch, where you have this Western observer behind the wall peeking at this whole event. And I think the role of the West in this narrative is very complicated. I imagine the goal for Japan, the model for Japan, it's an observer, but it's also a player in many ways. I'm just curious if you could elaborate more on how the West is constructed or how the West is plays in the construction of this narrative.
That would take a long time. You can read things in the Shanghai press and also in the press in Japan about these kinds of issues where Westerners were involved in writing stories in English about the war from the point of view of the Chinese in Shanghai and the Japanese in Japan. The Observer is actually an Englishman. Punch is a very famous journal that spoofs all kinds of things, spoofs Englishmen. So it was also spoofing the Englishmen, watching this war with these traditional kinds of values. And the samurai as a dwarf is the Chinese perspective, and the Goliath is in some ways not so much the Japanese view, but perhaps more the European view. The Japanese have certainly understood the scale of China. And dealing with it. And so the Goliath is a borrowing of a biblical image to bring into this kind of framework. But the Europeans is acting as if they're puzzled by this, I think is in many ways a kind of what I would call an optical illusion. They're very much involved in this. And what they want to see, one is that their interests are protected. And the Japanese honor protection of their interest in Shanghai. And then when the Japanese are unexpectedly successful in taking Port Arthur, and the other areas approaching Manchuria, the Russians, the French, and the Germans are very upset, and they begin to demand that the Japanese pull back, causing the Chinese to pay even more for that right to pull back. And the Japanese, without a single shot being fired or a battle being fought, are forced to withdraw from Port Arthur. So in that sense, the Europeans are terribly involved. And I think the Russo-Japanese War will begin to carry that forward. The Japanese are now in the new league, a new league of global warfare and global issues. Russo-Japanese War will be one of the first stages of that, then the Pacific War and the Japanese expansions into East Asia, into China, into Southeast Asia, are part of that as well. And there are already some predictions among some of the accounts in the Shanghai newspapers in the 1890s that Japan has gotten into something that in the end will be its own destruction. There are people that already see in the 1890s that Japan has now moved from a little island with limited resources to having depend upon the resources of a huge Asian continent, and it will pay the price of that when the other powers begin to eat it to death. In that sense. So I think the West is not just that standing on a ladder looking at this kind of warfare. They've been implicit in what's been happening in China. They've been getting treaty ports in Japan. Both Japan and China in this period of time are giving foreigners extraterritoriality, giving them their own special privileges. The Japanese and the Chinese are battling over, should Chinese have extraterritorial rights in Kobe, for example? And there are battles between sailors over that. And certainly, should the Japanese in China be given extraterritorial rights? So the West is implicit in all these issues and punched by making it seem as if the British observer is watching something that is happening on the battlefield. I think that's a misperception.
Would you like to say something?
Well, just briefly, I agree with Professor Ellman. The context is not just China and Japan, but it's the imperialist world order. And that's what you can't separate, and we tend to leave it out. And Japan's perception is that it must join this world order. And there's a great deal of, as I think you all know, Japanese social Darwinist writing before this. You're either meat on the table or you're one of the people that is dining at the banquet. That's their language. So you really do have to put it in the whole context of the unequal treaties, extraterritoriality. This is all preceded by the scramble for concessions. Russia is moving in. The question on who has the right to use images is a very interesting one. If that image of the execution is a perfect image to be shown in a Chinese museum of Japanese atrocities, where it would be absolutely accepted as one more example alongside of your photographs of Nanjing or Unit 731. Therefore, what can be used by Chinese or by victims in general takes on a different meaning when it's being used by others. I don't think the attack in 2006, though, I think there was there were various reasons that it took the course it did. One was the climate of the times. One was that people were very upset. One was that the name that was associated with it was a Japanese name. That's why there were reasons my name wasn't up with the email number, but it was up as the author. It didn't come so much to me. And all they just wanted was that I be fired. But it didn't come with the incredible race hate, racial invective, threats of violence and others. So what you were picking up there was an anti-Japanese sentiment that was part of what was being pumped up in China and has been since the 1980s in various ways. And that the specifically anti-Japanese nature of that nationalism. But it was very interesting to me because the image itself is only offensive because it was not being brought up by Chinese people saying, look at the terrible things that were done to us.
I think I saw Paul Cohen's hand.
I enjoyed both presentations very much. I thought they were really very, very stimulating. One issue that has come up in my own work and in my teaching has to do with fraudulent, not just people not paying attention to the context in which a picture, an image is shown, but also the fraudulent use of images, which is apparently not at all uncommon among journalists. After I published my book on the boxers in 1997, the History Channel put on an hour-long presentation on the boxers. And Joe Estrick and myself and Jim Hebbia were involved as talking heads, as it were. And we all noticed that a number of the pictures that were used by the History Channel, the dead outside the walls of Beijing, actually were pictures that had been taken in Tianjin, and things of that nature. Now, in this case, it didn't make, you can say, it didn't make a huge amount of difference, but it was very illuminating to me, there were other instances that I'd come across in my career where the picture is defined by the context, and the context may be a fraudulent context. So it's not just a question of people not paying attention to the context. It's a question in many cases of people being presented with a false context, and there's no way they can really know that that's the case. So pictures are dangerous.
Could I simply add?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, just briefly, we all talk about the uses of history, and now we're in a world of the uses of pictures that's overwhelming. I mean, it's just overwhelming now.
I would add, I'm going to talk tomorrow about philologists as rogues. This isn't new. It's going on a scale that's unprecedented, I think, because of the technologies that we have. But if one looks very carefully at the work of scholars today and before, and goes through the footnotes very easily, we find all kinds of issues involved that teach us something about our own profession and our own way of going about things. I will just give you one example from the sciences, since as someone in the humanities this troubles me, but 10 to 15% of the articles submitted to scientific journals are arguably forgeries. And there are now search engines by journals being produced to weed this out and catch all of this, because the competition is so great and the issues are so important and the reward is so paramount, both in terms of prestige and monetary reward. But tomorrow I'll be talking about Chinese and Japanese scholars working on texts that come from the same tradition, supposedly the Analects, making uses of it for particular purposes, and the text, not the image, is being manipulated. And so the texts themselves, they're being put in the mouth of Song Dynasty figures or Jin Dynasty figures, or even having been baked for the Qianlong Emperor in the 1780s to give a particular perspective of what these texts mean. So I share your concern. I think the concern now is that this is now at a velocity that is almost uncontrollable, that this can get out of hand just like that, whereas before the issues in the 17th century would be contained in such a way that the Japanese would never know what the Chinese made of their texts, and vice versa, until very late in the game.
I'm going to recognize one last question and then invite everybody to join us for drinks and snack up in the gathering room. Professor O'Dwyer, sorry.
Emer O'Dwyer, Oberlin College. The question I have actually is more about going forward in time rather than backward, and specifically a question of timing. So if I understand correctly, and anticipating what you will say in the next 2 days, you'll be looking backwards, but I mean, thinking about this sort of fall of China as a historical fable, I'm curious in terms of how quickly this thinking becomes such a sort of dominant narrative in the Chinese case, particularly if we think about the May 4th movement and Chinese intellectuals themselves lambasting their own culture. So thinking about post-revolutionary internal critiques of China and how it was seen to have betrayed its promise, and how that fits into your overall argument.
Well, fortunately for me, I don't predict the future, and I don't deal with the issues of the 20th, 21st century. I'll leave that to some other scholars that are here in the audience and do that far better than I do. I'm going to go back and look at beginnings as beginnings, but I grant you the issue of if the beginnings are today, or the beginnings were, say, 10, 20 years ago, given the politics of China vis-a-vis Japan, where it's going is unclear. And my own sense of fear would be that the academic world has to sort of get involved in keeping these narratives from getting out of control. In other words, I'm not predicting a narrative. I'm fearful of a narrative where we will see confrontations between China and Japan grow. Maybe I didn't understand your question.
My question, I'm talking about within 15 years or so
Yeah.
of the Sino-Japanese War, that already we have these very trenchant critiques of Chinese society.
It didn't take that long.
Yeah, no, it didn't take that long, but certainly 5, 15 years, it's very entrenched. And so I'm just thinking about
how did they get disentrenched?
What was the sort of momentous force that makes this narrative, tumble and tumble, get bigger and bigger? And sort of when do we see it at its kind of, maybe still, well, it's not still, but I mean, I'm just thinking that, this is not a narrative that suddenly in 1895 is fully formed, right? But that is one that will continue to evolve and grow in size and power, certainly, in the years leading up to World War I and then thereafter. So I wonder how much of that you have, sort of the snowballing of this
I think
narrative.
the areas I'm particularly interested in the snowballing is in art history and in Western versions of Chinese history and Japanese versions of Chinese history, to see how that evolved within those fields to have certain perspectives that snowballed on top of this kind of issue. The other side of it is the revolutionary narratives of China, which I don't work on in the Republican period and later under the Communist period, in building on these arguments that everything is wrong. The Cultural Revolution is a kind of continuation of the earlier New Culture movement, the role of the May 4th. These are building on each other in many ways, trying to build a new China. And given the failures and the invasions and the problems that the Chinese have over time, this focus on the failure narrative builds a kind of an inherent narrative that continues for a long period of time. But I will say I'm not a Republican historian. I'm not a PRC historian. And the continuation of those narratives is something I think I'm bequeathing to others to do. I will say, for example, Song history is a Japanese invention, is a kind of a fairy tale about the Song dynasty and all the possibilities. Miyazaki, Chisada, and the others were the ones that invented the Song Renaissance and all the stories about the rise of the Song as they were in the midst of belittling the Ming and the Qing and its failures, and that we are restoring a good deal of Ming-Qing history in the face of that earlier argument that the Song was the height of it all, and China began to fail from that point forward. The early modern narratives of Naito Konan and others are built into that narrative. Add to that the issues of art history that I tried to present a little bit today. I'll be working on those as well, but usually ending in the early Republican period.
Well, I think we have more than enough good reason to come back tomorrow. We have taken up well more than the time that we had allotted. I think that's testament to the great interest that these issues hold for all of us here. Again, we have a reception outside. Please join me in thanking